We're finally going to hit 2%, just as the target's going to probably go up to 3.5%, maybe even 5% if you throw in other security capabilities, broader security capabilities. So without a doubt, there's going to be pressure now. Hey, you finally caught up to the bus, but guess what? It's just left the stop and it's moving on to the next stop further down the street. So you better chase after it some more.
This is a special edition of the Expert Series podcast from the CDAI Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Monday, June 9th, 2025.
I'm announcing today that Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule. And we will further accelerate our investments in years to come. We'll start by changing the way we support and invest in our armed forces. We will change the way we arm the men and women who serve, so we can fight.
This morning, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a landmark defense investment, committing over $9 billion for 2025 to 2026, and pledging to meet NATO's 2% defense spending target 5 years ahead of schedule. As Canada takes this step, the critical question is, how will the government navigate the challenge of implementation? And what does this accelerated investment reveal about Canada's strategic intentions towards its allies and its perception of the evolving international security environment? Here with me to unpack the announcement and its significance, we're joined once again by Vincent Rigby, CDAI Board Member, former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, and Slater Family Professor of Practice at McGill's Max Bell School. Viewers will likely know there's a major defense announcement this morning, an announcement of an announcement yesterday on Sunday. But essentially what our listeners should probably know and have seen is that the major focal point of this announcement on defense delivered by Prime Minister Mark Carney is that Canada will be accelerating its investments to 2% of GDP on defense spending, much ahead of schedule, which was initially projected to be the end of the decade. So there's a lot of details that we still need to unpack. This announcement just came out, about an hour and a half ago. But from your initial reading and listening, what are some of the things that were discussed in the announcements that you think were most important for people to know and understand?
Well, thanks again for having me on the show, Josh. Always a pleasure. I guess my initial reaction was, on the surface at least, this is good news. So as you just stated, accelerating the rate at which we'll get to 2% defense spending as a percentage of GDP. It looks like they're going to try and get to it by the end of this fiscal year. So that's effectively March 2026. That's only 9-10 months away. So that is a real acceleration. Originally, it was, as you said, the end of the decade, 2030. So that's good news. And for the government of Canada, this early on in a new mandate to come out and make that kind of a commitment to defense, I think speaks volumes. And I like the fact that also the Prime Minister is committed to the 2%. The former Prime Minister referred to it as a crass mathematical calculation. We all know it is an arbitrary calculation, and it is a crass mathematical calculation. But the fact of the matter is we signed up to it, whether we like it or not. And we had a commitment to our allies to meet that 2% and to do it fast. I like the way the Prime Minister Carney couched it in terms of, listen, it's about meeting an allied obligation, but it's also about protecting Canadians at the end of the day. So we're doing this in our own national interest, and we need to do it. So that, I think, was good news for him to come out and say that so early on in a mandate, to make that commitment to defense in a real tangible way. That is significant. The flip side, if I can say it that way, is it'll be a challenge. And so, first of all, we still don't really have a lot of details. As you said, this announcement was only a few hours ago. Stuff is starting to trickle out through briefs to the media by officials. We're seeing some stuff that's been put up on the PMO website, on the D&D website. So $9 billion into the defense budget this year, covering things like capabilities and defense industrial plans, so closer cooperation with industry, partnerships with Europe, and I assume Indo-Pacific, a lot on recruitment and retention, which is good news because we all know the military is not going to go anywhere if they don't have the numbers back up to where they're supposed to be, especially on the regular side at 71,500. But the challenge is going to be how do you get all that money out the door? So $9 billion in one fiscal year, 10 months. So that's by the end of March 2026. We all know that the perennial problem of national defense has been getting money out the door. And the procurement process is in pretty dire shape. And so we've got to fix that. And so I also like the fact that Prime Minister Carney is committed to fixing procurement, including by creating a new procurement agency. But we haven't even got this new procurement agency up and running yet. It was only officially confirmed today, I think, that it's actually going to happen under the new Secretary of State for Defense Procurement. But you're going to be getting this thing up and running while at the same time trying to get all this money out the door. So to sum up, that's a lot. Good news. It's great. It's a great statement. And you can say there's just plain rhetoric, but it's still a statement of intent. But let's wait to see a few more details, a little bit more unpacking of those numbers, and let's see if they can get the money out the door at the end of the day.
It's a great scene setter, Vincent. Thank you for that. One kind of bigger question, maybe bigger kind of scene setter question before we dive into some of the details. What would you say this announcement signals about our evolving interpretation of the international security environment? There was lots of talk in there about allies or relationship with the United States, or at least kind of winks and nudges towards that, forming new alliances, great power competition. Is it possible that, this could very well even be a paradigm shifting announcement, or is it just quite an effective speech? Where do we draw the line there?
Well, I think that's a really good point, because one of the other things that jumped out at me, and I did get a chance to watch the speech in its entirety, about 25, 30 minutes, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. There's a lot of rhetoric, but there's still some good stuff in there. And some of that good stuff is his depiction of the threat environment. And I don't think I've heard a prime minister, certainly not the previous prime minister, speak publicly in such detail and with such conviction about the fact that we live in a very, very dangerous, unpredictable world. And so he went beyond just making that blanket statement. We were all used to hearing that. And those words have been overused: dangerous, unpredictable. The only thing I didn't hear was inflection point. But he really went into quite a bit of detail about the threat environment, about Russia's actions, about China's growing assertiveness on the world stage, regional wars, all the things that are happening out there. And then he did take a couple of jabs, not so subtle, at the U.S., monetized foreign policy and doing stuff these days where they're not the most reliable of allies, and that we can no longer completely trust them. Didn't say it as bluntly as that, but he has said it pretty bluntly in the past. So it was all there. A threat environment, an unpredictable, unreliable United States. He didn't use the term strategic autonomy, but he's used it in the past. And that was, I think, kind of the intent of the speech, was that we need to have strategic autonomy. We need to take care of our own defense. We'll work closely with allies, but we've got to get moving. But the depiction of the threat environment, I've been saying for a number of years, that you're not going to get Canadians on side. You're not going to be able to increase defense spending and get Canadian public support unless you can demonstrate to them that this is truly a very, very dangerous world. And I think he did a pretty good job on that front today.
So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the bilateral relationship and potential shifts we might be able to anticipate. Like you said, Carney did make some references to the United States, which weren't so subtle, and also saying other things such as, we want deeper alliances with stable democracies. We want partnerships with reliable allies, right? And I believe Carney's dissertation itself, I can't remember the full details, but I believe there was something in there about over-reliance on the United States. He also mentioned this in his speech, that we're over-reliant. So I guess my question is, during the election campaign, we saw, I don't want to say anti-American rhetoric, but we did see the Liberals lean in to, I think, Canadian sympathies about the U.S. administration based on what Mr. Trump had been saying at the time about annexing us. So, has this evolved from something that may have been purely in the realm of a campaign strategy, this rhetoric about the U.S., to something that's actually tangible and something that Canada is moving towards, decoupling a bit from the United States and possibly putting more of our eggs in the European basket, the rearm initiative, for instance?
I think he's starting to put meat on the bones for that, without a doubt. I mean, pick your pick your metaphor, but he has said again this notion of strategic autonomy, that we need to move away from the United States, that the relationship with the U.S. as it had been in the past was effectively over. He wasn't saying the relationship was over, but he was basically saying the way we conducted relations with the U.S. had pretty much come to an end. So on the defense side, now he's saying these are the things we need to do. So what was interesting is that of that $9 billion, a big chunk of it is aimed at a Canadian defense industrial strategy, where he said at least once or twice in this speech, we need to build up our own industry. We need to actually start making stuff again. And he also talked about working with partners outside of the United States. He specifically said we can no longer be in a world where 75 to 80% of our defense equipment is purchased from the United States. So he specifically mentioned Rearm Europe. I hope he starts to talk a little bit more about the Indo-Pacific at one point, because I think there are some burgeoning relationships there on the defense and security side that we can really leverage. And South Korea always jumps to mind for me, given that we know that potentially subs are on the table in terms of acquisition from South Korea, armored vehicles, artillery, etc. So there's some possibilities there as well. So I think for the defense industrial strategy and also the allied partnerships, I think that alone, was about $4 billion out of the $9 billion. So again, we don't know the details of how that money is going to be spent, but there were no lofty phrases about increasing U.S. defense cooperation. Now, having said all that, we all know that that is going to continue, and no one is suggesting, and he hasn't suggested, that we are going to completely bring to a halt all of our defense cooperation in the United States. That's not going to happen. And while all of this talk about reaching out to Europe or to other partners around the world, we're still talking to the U.S. now supposedly about Golden Dome and about ballistic missile defense cooperation. So the question is going to be, how do you square this circle? Looking for that strategic autonomy, looking for new partnerships, doing more homegrown defense procurement. But we still got to work with these guys, and we still have some big contracts that are out there, including the F-35, which I hope we're going to honor. And so just really trying to bring all that together into a coherent strategy at the end of the day. Strategic autonomy, yes, looking for new partners, but the United States is still going to be, when it comes to defense and security, pretty much anything in our bilateral relationship or even our multilateral relationships, is going to be that 800-pound gorilla in the room. We all know that.
Or elephant, as Pierre Elliott Trudeau used to say. One thing I did note in the announcement, Prime Minister Carney said that there would be more announcements to come that could potentially accelerate investments in the future. The NATO summit's coming up. I'm sure that at that summit, defense spending will be a big topic of discussion. Is there a possibility that we could get even beyond 2% in the shorter to medium term? And if so, what kind of ramifications does that have for Canadian society more generally? Like we have all these investments that we now need to prioritize and make. How do we meet those investments with personnel? So those are like kind of two different questions for you. Sorry about that, but
no, but there are a number of different elements to that question. I think it's a good one. Could we expect more? We well could. And we all know that when prime ministers go to NATO summits, there are usually some goodies to be announced. And so on the one end, you can say, well, he's got his announcement. Canada's going to be at 2% defense spending, hopefully by next year. But it's always nice to make some further announcements, something a little bit more concrete. He talked a lot about platforms, ships and drones and things like that in his speech, but we didn't actually see any of those details spelled out in the press releases. So maybe there'll be an announcement on that front. I mean, this is another part of the story, Josh, in the sense that we're finally going to hit 2%, just as the target's going to probably go up to 3.5%, maybe even 5% if you throw in other security capabilities, broader security capabilities. So without a doubt, there's going to be pressure now. Hey, you finally caught up to the bus, but guess what? It's just left the stop and it's moving on to the next stop further down the street. So you better chase after it some more. So that's the big issue now. And I know that he has said in response to that question about if the floor goes a little bit higher, he's not going to get completely wound up in that percentage. But the fact of the matter is, if it does go to 3.5% and countries start making moves towards that goal, there's going to be pressure on Canada to do it. I mean, I agree with what he said. get the capabilities you need. We'll figure out what the percentage is later on. But if Canada does sign up to a new commitment, and there'll be a lot of pressure, we're going to have to meet it. It certainly, as you suggested, if we start spending not much money on defense, $9 billion this year, billions more in the future, it's a different mindset, isn't it? We've not been spending that kind of money in a long, long time on defense. People are talking in Europe about economies on a war footing. Minister Jolie's made some comments somewhat in that realm, that we're in a quasi-war environment. We've got to start thinking that way. That's a big, huge mental shift, I think, for most Canadians. But that's why it was so good that he spent a considerable amount of time in that speech on the threat environment and why we need to spend this money. We really do. But the other thing that didn't come out of the speech is, where's this money coming from? So he said there are going to be trade-offs.
Tax cuts too.
There you go. So it was really interesting that, it's a windfall day for the Canadian Armed Forces, and I'm sure there's going to be celebrations in the halls of 101 Perks building. But other parts of government may be going, okay, whose hide is this coming out of? So I'm sure finance has done all the calculations, and we'll see. But we all know the deficit isn't shrinking, and there are lots and lots of other demands. He's made lots and lots of other promises. So those of us who take security seriously are overjoyed and happy that he's at least made the statement and made the commitment, as I said at the outset of the show. But where it's coming from will be interesting. We all know there's only so much discretionary spending in government. So much of it's locked in terms of transfers to the provinces. You can't cut that stuff. So you've only got a very small piece of that pie that you can play with. So it'll be interesting to see where this money's coming from.
I'm not sure if you can speak to this, Vincent, but a couple of years ago, it may have been an unthinkable prospect here in Canada. But back to the notion of matching investments with personnel. Canada has a recruitment and retention issue. Do you see a future in which we institute mandatory service, perhaps, or we'll need to provide further incentive for people to join the forces in a very serious and concerted effort?
Well, I've been asked this question a lot lately, and I point to Europe, where I say these conversations are happening on a pretty regular basis, and some countries are already moving in that direction. They really are. The standard response, I think, from your average Canadian would be, well, that's Europe, and they're closer to the threat, and you would expect that. The conversation has not gotten heated in Canada right now in terms of mandatory service. It might not be mandatory military service. It may be some kind of civil duty. It may be something a little bit different for teenagers or people just out of high school, whatever the case may be. I think I saw an op-ed in the Globe about a year ago. Should we be starting to think about this sort of thing? I'm not sure we're there yet. Conscription per se. No, I don't think we're anywhere near that kind of a conversation. We're not at war, but some kind of annual service. I don't think we should. Let's put it this way. I don't think we should say we're never going to have that conversation in Canada. We should just put it out of our minds. I think that's the wrong approach. And while it may not be on the front burner just yet, I definitely think it should be on the back burner. And it's good that people like you are asking those questions of people, because we have to have that discussion. So I'm kind of bobbing and weaving a little bit there because I'm being very Canadian. But I think the conversation, if we see the world continuing to unfold the way it is right now, let me put it this way. If that continues to be the trend, then that conversation could be coming our way sooner rather than later.
One specific of note that I found interesting, I'm sure others paying attention found interesting as well, the potential integration of the Coast Guard more into D&D. Am I being cynical? Is this could be a creative accounting thing to bolster that defense spending number, or can we maybe talk about some of the can we talk about maybe why it might be necessary to take those steps now?
Well, and that's the question, right? I think their budget is somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.5 billion a year, so that's going to be nice if it gets wrapped up inside the 2% target. So it's in that sense, it's nice to tick that box and say, okay, that's going to move us a little bit more forward. But there's a more fundamental question. If you're going to do it for the right reason and not just an accounting procedure. So we're moving closer to an American model where their Coast Guard is more closely aligned with their military. I suspect that those inside D&D and elsewhere in Ottawa are thinking in terms of what the Coast Guard can do. If it is under the D&D umbrella, I'm thinking potentially the Arctic and icebreakers and more interoperability with Canadian Navy vessels. So there is hopefully, and I think there is a rationale to have it under the umbrella of the CAF to increase capability and more bang for the buck in terms of a merger of the fleets. But here again, I go back to what I said at the beginning. We haven't had a lot of details. All we said is that it's going to come under D&D, but how that's going to transpire, what the time frame is, and what is the overriding goal at the end of the day. If it's not just about money, and if we accept it at face value, that it, because I'm sure most would say it's not just about money. There's a operational, strategic, policy reason for doing this. I haven't seen it spelled out. Maybe it has been and I missed it, but I haven't seen it clearly spelled out as to why we would do this. I suspect, again, it's got an Arctic element to it, but hopefully we'll see that in the coming days and weeks.
Thanks, Vincent. So I have two more questions. I wanted to kind of wrap up this part of the discussion, then ask you something about the NATO summit because it is coming up. So we've had this discussion about the defense announcement that came out today. I'm hoping that maybe you can sort of recap some of your thoughts. Once again, maybe you could drive home what you thought was your big key takeaway from it. Maybe reiterate what you think it spells for Canada's view of itself in the world and vis-a-vis allies. And then possibly if you have any recommendations or any additional thoughts to add on, I'll let you do that as well.
Well, again, I think it was good news in the sense that a government this early in its mandate is one of its first major big announcement comes out and focuses on defense and says that we are going to inject a lot of capital into the defense budget and enhance capabilities and take better care of our armed forces personnel, increase their numbers, work with defense industry, work with our allies, all the right messages, all the right pillars. So I was very happy on that front. This is good. This is the Prime Minister who takes this stuff very seriously, and he wants to come out, no pun intended, but shooting from the hip. But the flip side is it's going to be tough. And he said that himself, that this is going to be very challenging. So with all the problems around procurement and actually getting this money out the door in such a short time frame, it's unbelievably fast by next March, and then more to follow year after year after year. They're going to have to hire. I think this is part of the $9 billion. They're going to have to hire a lot of civilians in addition to military to enhance the procurement process. They're going to have to get that procurement agency up and running as quickly as possible. It's going to be a challenge. That old cliche about trying to build the aircraft while it's actually flying. It feels a little bit like that. But we shouldn't be complaining too much. People like you and I have been talking about this for years. We need the government to pay more attention. The last thing I want to do is now they finally made an announcement like this in a serious way, and then cut it to crap and say, oh my God, these are all the things that are wrong with it. Listen, this is good stuff. This is good stuff, but lots of work to do. And again, going to keep on coming back to that cliche, devil in the details. We'll see how it pans out. And I also thought it was interesting that it kind of got lost in all the other noises that he committed to another defense policy. You said that had to be updated. So we're getting like the UK, where we're doing a defense policy about every few years, if not quicker. He effectively said the defense policy is out of date. Now, is that going to get wrapped into the national security policy? I'm hearing rumors that the national security policy is going to be perhaps a little bit more like the UK integrated review from a few years ago. It'll have foreign policy, it'll have defense policy, all wrapped into it. I don't think that's a bad thing. If you are working on national security policy, why not pull all those together? I think that would be good. Listen, great timing. He's heading to a NATO summit. It's no coincidence that he's making this announcement just before a NATO summit, just before the G7. That's around the corner. All the right noises are being made, but the time has now come to roll up the sleeves and get to work and make it happen. But a tough road ahead, without a doubt.
Listen, and tangential to the actual announcement, but also of note, I believe Mr. Carney started the started the press conference on time and ended on time. So that's interesting as well. Vincent, the NATO summit's coming up just a little over 2 weeks away. I'm wondering if I can get your thoughts on what Canada should be anticipating at this upcoming summit, maybe what you think some of the central issues are going to be. We've had quite a year with President Trump coming back into office. You had Vice President Vance's speech, of course, at the beginning of the year at the Munich Security Conference. What are your predictions for the summit?
Well, I think that the U.S. will be front and center as always. It's impossible to predict what President Trump's going to say. I think the world has turned out to be a little bit more problematic and a little bit more challenging than he thought it was. The last time I checked, I think he said that he was going to resolve the Ukraine war in 24 hours. That's turned out to be a little bit trickier than he anticipated. So maybe with time he'll realize that the world is a little more complicated place than he figured it out to be, or that he figured it to be. So the U.S. will be front and center. What's going to come out of left field this time? Is it going to be the standard messaging? I mean, listen, there's been some good news, including from Canada. It would be nice for Trump to come and say, "Hey, my message is getting through. I like what I'm seeing. Europe's pulling up its stocks. The Canadians are pulling up their stocks. This is all good." But who knows? Who knows? But yes, U.S. front and center. The 2%. Does it get pushed up to 3.5, 5, whatever the case may be? Is it just a conversation this time, or is it going to get locked in? Is there going to be a pressure for individual countries to actually, commit formally to that new figure? That's going to be big. We got a new Russian offensive on Ukraine. Things are really heating up on Ukraine again. So interesting timing with the NATO summit. What to do on Ukraine? What to do with Russia and the conflict there? The ongoing relationship with the Indo-Pacific region. Again, from a Canadian perspective, we should be looking to that region, what we can get out of that, out of some of those countries and some of those partnerships. But I think we're never going to create a parallel NATO in Europe, in Indo-Pacific. Sorry, that's not in the cards. But ongoing cooperation in that regard, especially since so many of these conflicts are intertwined now, and Chinese and North Korean engagement in the Ukraine war. And then finally, just the Canadian piece. I mean, I think that Prime Minister Carney will be able to head into the summit with a little bit of confidence and with some good news. You'll recall the last summit we had when Prime Minister Trudeau went to Washington with no plan and no intent to talk about 2%. And you'll also recall that I think on the very last day of the summit, he got backed into a corner and he had to make an announcement. This time the announcement's been made. So Carney is going to go in there, I think, in a slightly better position. I think he's been a little bit more proactive. And so this augurs well for him. And to your question, whether there were some other announcements at that time, perhaps something more concrete as part of that $9 billion, I wouldn't be surprised at all. That would not be a bad thing. So a good news day, as I say, at the strategic level. But how it all plays out operationally and tactically, we'll see over the coming days, weeks, and indeed years.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.